Hello. This week's topic is state and local relations, so please make sure you read the assigned chapter before beginning the written assignment for the week. But I just want to give you just a little bit of background on this topic. So, state and local relations refers to the relationship between a state and its cities and metropolitan areas. One of the things you should understand about the relationship between the states and cities is that cities really do not have sovereignty. The concept of sovereignty is that a government has its own authority to govern. States have sovereignty within the federal system, so each of the 50 states has its own authority to govern. That's rooted in the concept of federalism in the U.S. Constitution. And so states do have the authority to govern themselves, and they have their own state constitutions. But the relationship between states and cities is much different. Each city in a state is actually created by the city in which it exists. So, for example, the city of Detroit was created by the state of Michigan. The city of Dearborn was created by the state of Michigan. Now, what happens when a state creates a city is it issues a charter, and then the city charter establishes the government for the city and how the city will operate. Now, typically, revisions to a city charter are made by the voters of that community. A few years ago, the voters of Detroit approved a revision to the Detroit City Charter, which allowed voters to choose city council members by district or ward rather than completely at large. So that was a revision that was made to the City Charter of Detroit. But again, the charter was initially issued by the state of Michigan when the city of Detroit was created. Actually, the city of Detroit existed even before the state of Michigan was a state. But in any event, cities do not have their own authority to govern. They get it from the state. The authors of your book refer to the concept of Dillon's rule, which is basically the idea that states create cities. But another thing that's important to understand is the concept of home rule. Now, states really don't have the time to run every city. Obviously, it wouldn't be feasible for the Michigan legislature or Michigan government to run every city in the state. So instead, states, when they issue charters, will give cities home rule. Home rule allows the city to pass its own ordinances without having to get approval from the state of Michigan or whatever state the city is in. A home rule exists in every state. When the city of Detroit or the city council of Detroit or the city council of Dearborn or some other community wants to pass an ordinance for the residents of that city, they don't have to get approval from the state of Michigan. But the state of Michigan or any state can take over cities when they're in financial distress. We saw this happen in Detroit several years ago. There was an emergency financial manager appointed to oversee the finances of the city of Detroit, and that was very controversial because the state voters in Michigan had repealed the financial manager law earlier, but the state legislature imposed a new one which remains in effect, and that allows the governor of the state to appoint a financial manager to oversee a city in distress. And so Detroit went through this process a few years ago. The financial manager ultimately recommended that the city go through a bankruptcy, and so the city of Detroit did go into bankruptcy in the summer of 2013, and it finally exited bankruptcy towards the end of 2014. And the financial manager was finally removed from the city. It was a very controversial period in the history of Detroit, obviously. Certainly, the issue of home rule came into play. Residents said, how can we have a financial manager who is not elected by us, basically determining our city's government and finances, but under the concept of Dillon's rule and the idea that states create cities, there was really not much the city could do, although there were certainly legal challenges, but not much that could be done. So, very controversial period in Detroit's history. Obviously, Detroit has exited bankruptcy and has been really on the upswing in a lot of ways, although certainly there are many problems that still exist around the city. But I just wanted to give that as an example because it is not discussed in your book, but it is an important example of how states and cities interact with each other. I also wanted to point out that when you have this idea of the state relating to the city, you also look at how cities can grow. and how metropolitan areas can grow. And we've seen that over the course of American history. If you go back to the 19th century, most Americans lived in rural communities, but with the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century, people started to move into cities, and certainly big cities like Detroit and New York and Boston and Philadelphia and so many other places grew and became these big urban centers. Obviously, Detroit's growth came because of the automobile. We were the center of the automotive industry, so the major automotive manufacturers had headquarters in Detroit, and the city of Detroit obviously boomed through that period. But over time, the state, or as the city grew, people started to move away from the city, and so with automobiles, people didn't have to live right in the core city; they could live a little bit farther out. So that in some places that also meant that public transportation kind of went away. We saw that here in Detroit. Obviously, we don't have much in the way of public transportation the way other cities do, and a lot of that is because we rely so much on the automobile for our economic base. If you look at in the book, the authors talk about the waves of development and growth in metropolitan areas. Certainly, the car brought a big part of that in the 1920s when cars became more widely available. In the 1950s, you had the baby boom, which occurred just after World War II. A lot of babies born when the soldiers returned home after fighting in the war, and they wanted to live in suburban areas, a lot of them, and so they moved away from the city into the first suburbs. Certainly, Dearborn grew because of that move away from the city, and some cities, and certainly we saw this in Detroit, started to decline in population. I will point out that racism was a big factor in a lot of that. If you look at the history of Detroit and what happened, certainly racist real estate policies where realtors were steering people into certain neighborhoods or away from certain neighborhoods based on race. That occurred very much in the city of Detroit and certainly led to the residential segregation that still exists in our community, even though it's not required by law. It happens through circumstances, and it's a legacy of our history. And that happened in a lot of other places in the country too, not just in the Detroit area. Some people will always point to the uprising that occurred in 1967 in Detroit as kind of when you had white flight from the city. But the reality is that a lot of that was happening even many years before the 1967 events. And much of that, probably most of it, was a result of a lot of racism among realtors and racism among leaders of the city and policies of the federal government that were either racist or certainly not very progressive. You saw the development of the interstate highway system, which was a very positive thing for a lot of people, but it also destroyed urban areas. We can see this again in Detroit if you look at the major interstate highways. Keep in mind that those highways are going through places that used to be neighborhoods, and those highways disrupted those neighborhoods. So not a great history there, but just some background that you should understand about what happened in the 1950s and 60s in Detroit and in a lot of other places as well. We've seen in recent years even more growth in metropolitan areas and suburbs. Again, just looking at our own area, the Detroit area, we've seen more people moving even farther away from the inner ring suburbs to far-flung places in Macomb County and Oakland County and in western Wayne County. And then you start to see what some people call as edge city. You have edge cities and the growth of again, the expansion and what some people would refer to as sprawl that's discussed in the chapter. Please make sure you read through that because it's an important concept to understand. Because the problem with sprawl can be that you have to extend all the infrastructure out to these new suburbs. People are driving farther distances. Jobs start to move to those places, which makes it harder for people living in the core city or the inner ring suburbs to get to where they need to be to work. And that's obviously an enormous problem in our area because we don't really have much in the way of public transportation. We have the bus system, no rail lines to speak of, so it is a problem in our area more so than a lot of other areas. So just wanted to highlight some of those issues. Certainly make sure you read through the chapter carefully, but I did want to highlight some things that are very specific and unique to the Detroit area. But the things that have happened here are not unlike the things that have happened in a lot of other places, but it's probably been more I don't know what the word is, but certainly more of a problem here than in a lot of those other places, or more accentuated here, I guess maybe is the word I'm looking for. So if you have any questions, please email me, and I hope you have a great week. All right, take care.